Okay. Dame и господа, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, дами и господа, добре дошли в Коридор 8. Welcome to Corridor 8. Аз не съм Тане Величков, аз съм Иван Динев Иванов и заедно с Георги днес имаме прекрасен гост, професор Ипек Yosmaoğlu. So we'll switch into English and we'll have the rest of the episode in English now. So Professor Yosmaoğlu is Associate Professor at Northwestern University's Department of History. She finished her PhD at Princeton and wrote a number of research pieces. One of her works that we would like to spend more time talking about today is directly linked to the topic of Macedonia and the common history, or the history that, let's say, that we have of this region that affects, of course, the peoples living and nations living in this part of the corner. So her book published in 2014 is called Religion, Violence and the Blood Ties, Religion, Violence and the Politics of Nationhood in Ottoman Macedonia, 1878-1908. She also is working on several other exciting projects. She'll tell us a little bit more about that. But without further ado, because we have limited time, let's get started with Professor Yosmaoğlu. And one of the reasons why we have her is because I think the book is very interesting. We already talked about this in previous shows in January when we talked about nations and nationalism. I myself have used her work also to talk to some audiences in Skopje when I was a guest to one of the shows, Truth Only, in May of this year, and also on the occasion of several shows that we had of the 120th anniversary of the Ilinden uprising. This is also probably going to be our last show related to the 120th anniversary of the Ilinden uprising. And so what I want to, Professor Yosmaoğlu, is to start and tell us a little bit about what sparkled your interest in late 19th, early 20th century Macedonia, region of Macedonia, Ottoman Macedonia, and also if you will look up into, because you start with the Ilinden uprising and a large part of it is centered around the idea of Ilinden. Why should we celebrate, and how should we celebrate, in your opinion, again, as a historian, as a scholar, this event? So.
Can I go ahead now? Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Well, thank you so much for this invitation, and for putting this podcast together. I am now realizing you have already produced quite a few of these. It's very interesting and allowing me to, even though I can only reach your audience in English, obviously, to also revisit my book. It was published 10 years ago. Yes, 10 years ago almost. And I really have not been working on this region since then. I kind of, published it and let it just, go out in the world, and talked about it in the next few years. But then, because I have moved to an entirely different project, I haven't been thinking about the project itself for a while. But of course, Macedonia is always on our minds, right? So, and I think, there are a couple of questions there that you just raised. One was, about the book in general and what sparked my interest. And then it was also about the Ilinden uprising, which is where the book is. Ilinden is just part of, it's one of the episodes in the book. It's about the period following the Congress of Berlin. But and the main argument of this book, it's just in one sentence, is that the assumption is that ethnic violence or nationalist violence follows from national differences. So the differences are there, people's self-identification, it's there, and that from that strife, conflict, and that violence follows. So this book basically just turns that completely up on its head and argues that no, it's actually the other way around. You first need to have violence for those differences to be defined and then, gel into place and also become a sort of conflict. Even if they are there, without that kind of intervention, you're not going to have the kind of several levels of violence, I should say, that supposedly is, following. So, the horse and the cart kind of thing, the reasoning, the whole reasoning behind this. But I didn't really start this. This is based on my dissertation, and I didn't start my dissertation project thinking this is what I'm going to do. This is something that, this is the point I ended up after, doing my research. And at the beginning, I wasn't even that interested in nationalism per se. I was, more interested in looking at what happens to, I wanted to write a microhistory, and I wanted to look at, what happens to local communities once those imperial frameworks and networks that they're used to functioning in, once those fall apart. And so I started my research when I was a fellow in Athens at the Gennadion, the American School of Classical Studies. That I'm sure you're aware of this wonderful resource, the Gennadion Library. So I figured it would make sense for me to go and take a look at some maps first to visualize these networks and what was going on. And the maps that I kept finding were really interesting. They were not the kind of maps that I expected to find, but they were mostly what was called ethnographic maps. And needless to say, they contradicted one another. They did not agree on anything. And so I think that was my finding these maps, looking at them, it was my first cue to, start questioning things that I think, taking for granted about the history of this place, this period. And so, the logical next step is when you're looking at these maps, you see the ethnographic maps, just, insane, especially if you're considering a region like Macedonia. Territoriality, of course, becomes a very, important, or rather territorialization, I should say. So that was the first category I started exploring to make sense of what was going on. And how map making, which was, it was first introduced by Western European ethnographers into this region, but then it was taken up by the local elites themselves, and it was turned into, kind of very cleverly, I should say, turned into a tool in the service of nation making. Because it was clear that this was one way of projecting power, one way of, basically you had to imagine this nation on paper before it could be, the lines, the actual lines could be drawn. And of course, even though this looks like this is taking place on paper, there's a certain violence in this project, in this whole process, if you think about it. And that is of course, what these maps do not show, what does not fit into that medium, this medium that, by definition, flattens, encloses, collapses everything, and, gives you these pictures as if, you can separate these people from one another, and as if people are just one thing and not the other. So these are assumptions that we make, which were not necessarily, true at the time. And then, how do you get that information anyhow? Like, who decides, for instance, who's Bulgarian and who is Greek or who is Vlach? These were not, I mean, to us today, it may seem like, well, of course people knew what they were. No, they did not, when you look at it, and they just didn't care, some of them. So that's why, another part of my research then went into researching this question, and that I wrote another section of the book, and that was based on, among other things, the census practices, and how just trying to give people an identity card, dividing them, classifying them according to their sectarian affiliation in this case. It was not just a statistical exercise. It was, again, it could be the difference between life and death, because people were, they knew that information could be used against them or for them. And they also, some people did not understand why they had to choose one or the other. They didn't understand why, instead of saying they were Christians, for instance, they had to, actually indicate whether they were, they belonged to the patriarchate or the exarchate. This was one of the most important, as you can imagine, conflicts. And but then even as late as this is, taking place 1903, 1905, it's pretty late in the game, you would think. Still, you see this negotiation taking place, between officials and the people who are being counted. So this is yet another indication that we're talking about a period when things are still very much in flux. They can, fall either way. But of course, we also know, with the benefit of hindsight, that they're not going to stay this way for a long time. So, and I mean, I don't want to go into a much longer summary of the book, but of course, religion is very important. And I think one thing that I would like to emphasize, because many people do not realize that there was actually some kind of these people who, we assume were at each other's throats, constantly fighting with one another. Even after the break, the schism between the patriarchate and the exarchate, the people who belonged to these different, sects were actually, they were quite capable of figuring out a modus vivendi. And for instance, they shared the church. They either took turns, or they used it at the same time. They had liturgy in both languages. But again, this became more and more difficult to sustain, the state of affairs. And how? And that's when the armed, insurgency, armed bands. So when I'm talking about armed bands, I'm not only referring to the militias there, but I'm also talking about the, state forces, regular and otherwise, the local gendarmes, and these several, bands belonging to different political factions in the area. So it's their intervention and, the turf war between these people with access to coercive means, with access to weapons. Their involvement will make it more and more, impossible to, preserve this delicate balance, or, this like I said, modus vivendi. And that's ultimately the factor that will, harden those boundaries, because, the more violence you have, the more difficult it is for you to sit the fence, so to say. You need to pick your side. But then, even so, I then looked into instances of violence. Instead of saying, well, oh, lots of people died, there were attacks and everything, I actually, sat down and try to analyze the violence itself in its own right. And then you end up with a really complicated picture where, there are other things that contribute to the outbreak of attacks, hostilities. It's not just simply ideological. It has to do with, location, insurgency, espousing geography. It also, and above all, it has to do with, whether there is, any chance of changing the allegiances of the majority of a certain locale. And it escalates to a certain point where, violence is no longer targeted. Back when it first starts, this insurgent violence, you can see clear cases where this is used to punish certain people so that they stay in their lines, and also they do not tell on anyone. They if necessary they help the guerrilla. But after a certain point, you see people being attacked or killed, or through any other means being subject to coercive violence, just because of who they were or who they were perceived to be, rather than what they did. And that's a very important, actually, I would say, transformative step in that process. And of course, as you know, this region is not, once the Ottoman Empire is no longer there, that is not really the end of the hostilities, as you know. So it's not really a resolved issue after that. So I think I'm going to stop there, like summarizing the book and how I came to start this project, just by saying that I, in general, even though I'm not working on Ottoman Macedonia at the moment, this is something I think about, in the sense that I always find it intriguing how people just will, find yourselves, define themselves as part of a whole, and let that conviction guide their behavior, and also even lead them to commit violence. And it's not something that's limited to Macedonia, obviously, or to the Balkans, I should say, because there's, of course, this assumption that the Balkans, people have been enemies of each other since time immemorial, these, ancient hatreds and all of that. And that I would like to emphasize is, that's a myth that needs to be debunked. And even though there's plenty of stories of violence and animosity, that does not mean that this is an exceptional place, that this is a place like no other, and because it's backward, or because there are ancient hatreds here. So I would like to also challenge that a little bit. And I think even though a huge part of my book was about violence, I tried to make the case that this was not particularly Balkan story, but this was a story of transition to nationhood, which I argue is always a process of violence.
Yeah, this is probably one of the reasons for what Professor Tuludi from Thessaloniki, or Solun, wrote.
Selanik, you can also say. I think it's Selanik is in Turkish, right?
Yeah.
Selanik, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So she wrote us that according to the British Foreign Office archives, the local people of the area were preferring to be left alone away of any kind of ethnic conflicts and probably any kind of self-determination, especially if being loyal to certain identity could provoke violence, and people try to avoid such problem. And we have a friend from Istanbul, Argir Stumbov. Our friend is here. Nice to see you, Argir. I can't read this in Turkish.
Okay.
İyi akşamlar. Size de iyi akşamlar.
Okay.
Good evening. It's still daytime here. Good evening to you in Istanbul and in Sofia. The time difference is Sofia.
Same time, same zone,
Oh, it's
same
the-
zone.
okay.
Skopje is 1 hour ahead.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah. So I think that you kind of touched upon our second question, which was about your interest in the 19th and early 20th century Macedonia. And I think you explained very well. You were interested to see how violence actually shaped formation and emergence of national identities. So I'm going to pose question number 3 because it's kind of hitting the nail on the head, or grabbing the bull with the horns, But it's an interesting quote on page, I think it was page 16 of the book, which you say that despite the myths of national purity and continuity that came to dominate the official historiographies on the Balkans, there's not much to be gained from search for Macedonian national lineage, as if it were already there to be discovered intact. The politics of modern Macedonian nationhood, on the other hand, is another matter altogether, the defining elements of which were shaped more in the decades following World War II than in the prelude of World War I. Now, this is very controversial, if you say it, in particularly in Macedonia, but some Bulgarians may or may not like it. So I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about this. As you know, this assertion is fairly controversial. So let's clarify. What does the archives, literature on Ottoman Macedonia, say for the most part about the Slavic population in the late 19th and 20th century, those who were both under the rule of the Exarchate and, of course, some of them under the rule of the Patriarchy. And to what extent do you think they belong to the Bulgarian nation building project at that time? From your perspective, from the perspective of the Ottoman archives, and also from the perspective of the international scholarship on that topic during that period. We have a viewer called Andromeda who's basically arguing, well, they were Bulgarians because they spoke Bulgarian, and they were Greeks because they spoke Greek, but were they really Macedonians? Were they thinking about being Bulgarian or Macedonian or Greek or stuff like this? I know it's a complicated, but I think you make an assertion. So I want you to give a chance to talk a little bit about, of course, we're talking about 19th century nation building. We're not talking about 21st century identities, but I want to sort of based on that quote, to elaborate a little bit about the identity of the Slavic population, the context in which that identity existed during that period, And I think it's important for both Bulgarian and Macedonian viewers. They're going to be asked. I know each one of them listening now is asking this question, so I want to give you a chance to address it.
Okay, well, I don't think I'm able to give an answer that will satisfy or disappoint anyone. But first of all, I actually don't think this is a very controversial statement. I mean, it says basically that I think you are, if I'm understanding you correctly, because I say there is not much to be gained from a search for Macedonian national lineage, as if it was already there to be discovered and tagged. The politics of modern Macedonian nationhood, and then I say, it has the politics of that, meaning the debate about Macedonian nationhood is, a question for the period after the Second World War. I do not mean there that, and I make it really clear in this book elsewhere. Maybe it's, let me see. Oh yeah, here it is. As long as I'm reading from the book, since you quoted too, it's the page before, one page before 14. As long as there are thousands of people who call themselves Macedonians as distinct from Greeks or Bulgarian Macedonians, the insistence that they were confusing a communist supra-identity with genuine nationhood, however we define it, is intellectual thuggery. Their sense of belonging to a particular nation is no less valid than that of any other national group, and their national identity is no less authentic than others. So, I mean, I make it very clear in this book that I'm not after, proving or disproving the existence of Macedonian national consciousness here. I'm talking about nationhood as an abstract category that becomes, solidified. And so it is not, a question of who these people actually were. It's a question of how this issue was talked about, how the outsiders talked about it, as opposed to what people themselves made of it. So you can, you can just from today look back and say, look, they were speaking Greek, so they must be Greek. But the same person may say, okay, I speak Greek because that's, that was the language of my school. But, I attend the Exarchist church, so I'm not Greek. I'm not Bulgarian either. People may have a very localized identity. So I think it is a little unfair to, use our own assumptions to ascribe an identity to them, a fixed, I should emphasize, fixed identity to them, from our position here. I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but this is why, I would not want to make any pronouncement about, what the majority of sources called them.
That works very much in the message that I was sending in January. So I'm glad to hear that identities are social constructs in a specific period, and that we cannot think from the 21st century onwards. And I should say I like the answer. I like the counter response that you did from page 15. I didn't bring that as an answer because I think that one was kind of more than obvious, and we've always been arguing that present day identities have to be respected as they are. But what you're also saying, and I think I'm not trying to put the words in your mouth, but this nationalist identity narrative that identities were 19th century exactly the same as they are today, and they knew that they're Bulgarians or Greeks or Turks or Jews or Roma or whatever, Vlachs, Aromans, just because, and they've always remained like this for 200 years, 100 and something years. So it's a great point. So I appreciate that clarification. So we want to go, Gosha, to the fourth question. And so I'm trying to push you. You probably have heard in the context, history has become something that we've talked too many times about it, and that's why we're actually glad that we bring historians who study the period. We've had a lot of politics decision with regard to a historical commission that we have, that the lack of progress there because the two groups cannot somehow agree on how to formulate common this. Because I think you would probably agree that there is this thing called common. I think we have a question later about common history, but so the question that I have is that how different are today's blood ties among different peoples in the region compared to 120 years ago, and to what extent should the past continue to divide the two nations, or can it serve as a tool to bring them together? So how does today's dispute about reading, because obviously the two national narratives very well because you address them in the textbook, from your perspective, through the eye of an American scholar and a Turkish academic studying late or who has studied back then during that period when you published the book and your dissertation, the late 19th and early 20th century Ottoman Macedonia. How should we use, basically in a nutshell, the past to tell a story that actually brings the people together more so than to tell a story that divides the people, that points fingers at each other, and that brings an argument, some of those that you just debunked, both the one that I read, the quotes on page 15 and 16, and then the one on 15 that you also pointed. How should we think about history, sort of like forward? Again, you're not telling the historical commissions or your colleagues how to do it. You're just talking about, from your perspective, how does this whole topic seem and look?
Well, I mean, this is a very difficult question, especially. And I have to say, I'm also surprised that you did not bring Greece into this when we're talking about, animosity and, that resistance just to the name Macedonia. And because, okay, they were also the other, important, national entity claiming these people, and also we're not talking about Serbians who were also present. But I think I understand what you're trying to do. Like, instead of concentrating on these divisions that people find among themselves, what can we find in this history that would actually bring them together? Do I understand you correctly? Yeah, and I think there's actually a lot there. So this also happens to be the 100th centenary of the Turkish Republic, as you know, and the Lausanne Treaty was a very important, foundational document in the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And we have, recently had a number of meetings to discuss it. And so, honestly, there isn't a lot to be, one cannot find a lot to be celebrated at these anniversaries. If you're a historian and you know that what those dates meant to people who actually experienced those dates, like millions of people who had to leave their homes, or, another million who were killed, or, the population transfers, genocides, and all of that. So one of the things that becomes really common, it's part of the language of international relations, of diplomacy, is the unmixing of peoples, especially after the First World War. It goes with self-determination and those terms that are being thrown around after Paris, the peace conference. And I think the experience of people in Macedonia is like a kind of it foreshadows what happens later on. This unmixing, the commissions on ethnic identity determination, commissions on ethnographic map making, because they used similar maps during the Paris peace conference too. These are, the people in Macedonia experience these, and I think their experience should have told others that there isn't really a very, how can I say, positive outcome to be gained from trying to separate people. So I guess if people were to read the period without, leaving aside their prejudices, dropping the assumption that they know who is Bulgarian and who is Greek and all of that, and the assumption that this is something that mattered to people, then I think they would be able to find that there are things that are of more consequence to normal people, like, making a living, like the health of their children, like having access to education, like having a legal system that is functional. And these are not, Bulgarian or Macedonian demands. These are, universal demands. And they could also maybe find that there wasn't these differences that we, really blow up and paint into a huge thing. These differences, they were there, but they didn't matter that much. So if people can, read this book or any other book about this period, and, get the idea that, conflict is not inevitable. It's not, the natural outcome of difference, then I think that would be a good, way of moving forward and concentrating on things like, things that will make our lives better, rather than being stuck on, debates about whether this word is really, I won't go into language. I'll give you one like terrible example, whether, dolma is Turkish or Greek, this kind of thing. And agree that, this people ate together. So it is Turkish, it is Greek, it is Bulgarian, it belongs to everyone.
Thank you so much. We had another question, Goshe. This is 5, I think, and this was just it's a short question. So I was just curious if you've had, particularly because it touches upon a number of issues. You could add Greece as well, but have you talked to historians from both Bulgaria and North Macedonia? Have they reached out to you, and have you had some response on their end about your book? Some interaction, I guess. I'm just curious we're just curious to know about how professional community in Bulgaria and North Macedonia in particular has responded to your work.
Yeah.
If you've had
no, I mean, it's really interesting. One really weak part of my book, and I mean, I recognize it, but on the other hand, there's nothing I can do. It was either, try to go pick up a few more languages or publish it the way it was. I use mostly Ottoman sources, French and British consular reports. And I also use, because I did part of my research in Greece, I also use some Greek resources, but they were mostly published documents, and also, Greek secondary literature. And I didn't really, and because the region that I was working on, the first local history that I started writing, it happened to fall in the Greek side of the border once the dust settled and the borders were drawn. I did not really have many contacts. I didn't really do any reach out work myself, nor have I heard from anyone from Macedonia or Bulgaria about this book, except for some personal connections that I have who happen to be historians. So yeah, I mean, I kind of regret that. I wish, and I'm assuming that a lot of people probably don't know about it. That may be one reason, or maybe it's something that does not. I really don't know the readership. What there's a demand for. So yeah, that's something I regret has not happened.
I actually, if I may respond to this. Is I actually loved this. Is exactly the reason why I loved your book, because I looked up at the sources that you cite at the end. I saw no single Bulgarian source. I loved it for that reason, because like I am not influenced. Somebody may say I've been brainwashed by thinking about this period and the context in which, and I can't read Ottoman archives. So you telling me something that I cannot read. I've read the only actually, if you say Bulgarian authored book, it's Anastasos, The Tragic Peninsula.
Yeah.
And that book takes you apart from your book. I think it's like 78, 76 years, something like that. That was written in 1938, with the map of Macedonia and all this stuff. So I think that was actually your weakness, is actually, I think, the value for this. So our next question, I wrote it, I admit that. It may be seen as a little bit provocative, but I think you take a very clear position. This is question 6, and I'll let Georgi read it because he said that he liked the question itself. So I'll let him read it, and I'll let you talk a little bit about that, because we've got also some questions from the other folks. Is about how the world historiography, world community responds to some of the claims made by Macedonian historians about that period. I think you take a very clear position. So Georgi will read the question because he said he liked it. I wrote it, but he liked it. So, and then I'll have you talk a little bit about that. I think it's an important thing to talk about as well.
Yeah, I really love this question. So, Professor Yosmaoğlu, in your book, you write that the modern Macedonian historiographic equation of demands for autonomy with a separate and distinct national identity does not necessarily jibe with the historical record. In this context, what is the borderline between myth-making and fiction? How do we reach out and persuade the public in North Macedonia, which accepts claims about the past that do not necessarily jibe with the historical record?
Okay, well, difference or the border between myth making and fiction, right? That's the question. I suppose that would be that would simply be in your intent, and I mean, I don't know if it is our job to, persuade people that something that they believe is wrong or myth. It's not as if there isn't it's not like this is something completely fictive. There is a movement there, and it is the name Macedonia in its title. But what I'm trying to say in this book is that, look, these people are not necessarily, all of them, extreme nationalists. And what I mean by that is they do not fall within this mold that we tend to associate with, especially, at the end of that century, once, it becomes clear that nation state equals a homogeneous nation state. They do not have that kind of agenda necessarily. And they do not think of ethnic cleansing or national homogenization as, part of their political agenda. And it is very difficult to know for sure what kind of ideology motivated them. And this is not, I have to say, this is not just revolutionaries in Macedonia. It's also, if you think about it, the other end of the Ottoman Empire, Armenian revolutionaries. It is, of course, later on, after the fact, retrospectively, you say that they were Armenian nationalists. But when you read what they write at the time, when you look at their actions, it is not really a given that they were asking for an independent nation state that would not have any other elements. That's not really that clear. But again, once these differences become politicized in different ways that can only be, justified by nationalism, then you have an entirely different picture, and it becomes, I suppose, difficult to imagine that people might have had different ideological concerns. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be rather presumptuous just to say that I can, I can show you the true story here. This is what happened, and what you think is wrong. I cannot do that. I don't think we should be doing that. But what we can do is we can just put the information out there, and also I think make it clear that nobody's national identity is being threatened here. And there is space for this discussion, without denying the existence of that kind of national consciousness. But, at the same time, respecting the other alternatives and the fact that these things were not written in stone.
Thank you.
So we have a few other questions because we were also running and a little bit out of time, But what I don't know how much you want to address those, but sort of if you were the next, if you want a 7 and 9, they were kind of like. I know it's hard, and I don't mean to challenge you to press you to tell me what you would recommend your colleagues in Bulgaria, North Macedonia. But if you were to make recommendations, and that's also linked to question number 9, Georgi, is how should your colleagues, in your opinion, think? And I think you already provided some of those answers. And also, if you wanted students in Bulgaria and in North Macedonia to read about a past that brings them together, what is known in the history and in the documents that the two countries have signed as common history, how would you make that sound like? What is the common history? And I think you've already implied some of it, but if you just sort of write a couple of sort of sentences and statements, how to think about the common history of the 19th century Ottoman Macedonia. That's it's maybe a little bit vague, but it's the story is if the theme is common history. Is there any first? I would assume you would say that there is a common history.
I try to answer these questions in different ways in my previous answers, but one thing that, because I don't know historical writing, I cannot read Bulgarian or Macedonian, so I don't have access to these historiographies. But I'm guessing that historiography in these two places is professional historiography is different than what is being taught in schools. Is that assumption correct?
Yes, correct. Yes. Okay. So this is what I wanted to tell you. The Macedonian, particularly the one taught in the textbooks, the official one is actually they publish documents like this, And for example, this is about the immigration in the United States and the Yugoslav diplomacy. And you can see that that Macedonian immigration, the Slavic immigration, was more or less felt the Bulgarian national idea and the Bulgarianness, a lot closer in the sense, pretty much in the sense that Banats and other scholars from that period are documenting this. Problem is, of course, in the historical, in the textbooks in history, the way that they present it is that there was this autonomous, generous Macedonian nation building. And I asked Chepreganov, who was the former director of Institute for National History in Skopje, so when does the nation building project start? 19th century is when nationalism starts in the Balkans. Greek project comes out probably the earliest, and at a later stage, other projects come, the Serbian project, but also the Bulgarian national project. Much later, also the Albanian national project in various forms. The institutions of that nation building project is linked to schools, churches, municipalities, communities, sort of communes, communities, общини, and so on. So the question I asked him is, when does the Macedonian nation building project start? And so he says about the same time. And I said, well, no. the evidence doesn't support it, and then he sort of goes on to defend and debunk the idea that there was something like a Bulgarian nation building project. Bulgarian institution says, yeah, they were there, but that doesn't matter. It has no connection whatsoever. So they're becoming completely dismissive, and they're trying to extrapolate this 20th, 21st century identity down into the 19th, back into the 19th century, and of course that for many of us is irritating, because that's accepted by the broader part of society. And whenever they see the word Macedonia, they say, hey, there is this Macedonian national identity. Of course, there was a feeling Macedonian related to the region, to the geography and to stuff, but they're trying to extrapolate and to present that there was a nation building project without having any institutions, notable institutions. So, and because they run out of institutions, they pick IMRO as the only institution where they probably were the most ardent Bulgarian nationalists, and you describe that very clearly in your textbook. So at a professional level, I don't think they deny that, but at the textbook level, they do deny it. Bulgarian nationalists, of course, and I think you also write in your textbook, are going in the other extreme. It's all Bulgarian. It didn't matter the local, the autonomy. That doesn't matter. It was really the idea of building a single nationhood, and that's it. So they only see the Bulgarian in Bulgaria without seeing the various other aspects of it. And in the end of the day, the localized movement, the connections, and the fact that you had pre-modern and modern identity mixing up and stuff like this. So you can see I'm trying to, and again, this is my biased reading on what historiography is. If I'm wrong, then I apologize. But and so obviously there's something to be criticized on both ends. That's why I wrote the questions the way I did them. I think there's probably more to be criticized on the Macedonian end, because it rests on certain sort of an assumption that a nation building project and a separate Macedonian national identity existed, or even ethnic identity existed. And not only that, they go as far back as Alexander the Great to show the lineage and the connection, which through various different ways and means has sustained and existed itself. And of course, that's why many of the historians say we don't have any common or shared history with the Bulgarians. And then they go in one step further. What about all this population censuses, all these documents, the Ottoman archives that are saying Bulgarian, Bulgarian, Bulgarian? Say, oh, but that is the Miliet system. The Miliet system had nothing to do with national identity. It is a system that basically they just had to pick up. They were Christians, and then after that they became Bulgarians. They didn't really think about identity as in that sense. Problem is, much of that doesn't get published in North America and in English, because it doesn't go through the filters of the peer review process, which sometimes can be excruciating, as you can see. Now, granted, some extreme Bulgarian narratives, which they're not looking at the Macedonian part of the Macedonian Bulgarian identity, or the people who identified with this project, were also ignoring a lot of important details, and they're also not publishing much in English. So Chavdar Nikolov, Chavdar Marinov, whom you cite, and others, Bechev has published some stuff. So they of course know much more how to explain that and put it in a framework that is more modern, more sort of identity building. And so my question is, and again, I'm just presenting this as, and so in this case, podcasts, people who you invite them, and particularly who are subscribing to one or the other narratives, are very holding on to these narratives, and I apologize for probably not providing the background. But if you were to tell the students in a textbook, about the 19th century, and if you were to tell the historians in Bulgaria how to think about, as a suggestion, I wanted to extract, how would, in your opinion, would you, and I think you implied on some of this, that there's a lot more shared identities, that they shared a lot more daily routines, but to what extent the idea of nation also, and to what extent the idea of nation was developed to matter for these people, based on, again, your work. I'm trying to extract some of your thoughts, again, or suggestions, how to think about this. I hope it makes sense now. I tried to provide more lengthier background.
Yeah, well, I think it's still very, difficult for me to, prescribe some kind of, major outlines of national textbook narrative, but I think it would be the same thing that I would say to, for instance, if Turkish and Greek Cypriots were trying to write a history book that would, one day, let's dream, one can dream, that one day they would be, having the school kids read in their history classes. I would ask them to imagine, how would you tell the story in a room where you know that your neighbor will be there, and where you want to highlight what is shared rather than, arguing about who was where first. And so again, I think I'm repeating myself, but focusing on what we can identify objectively, and also highlighting what is grounds for reconciliation rather than, division and getting into competitions about authenticity or originality. Because, I mean, if you want to take this all the way back to Alexander, then, Greek nationalists will be there too, and that won't be a very, nice scene. So.
Goshe, you want to go to the last question, because I think I want to give you a little bit of time to talk a little bit about your more recent project, and we're almost hitting the 2 p.m. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to show the last question, but just the first part, and then she can talk a little bit about the immigration and what is her Professor Yosmaoğlu. Do you have the? Okay.
It's okay.
So yeah, we'll drop the second part of the question because.
No, you don't have to drop it. It's okay. I mean, of course, when you say Macedonia, actually, it's not just Salonika. There was a pretty sizable community in Monastir as well, Bitola, and other places in, Ottoman Macedonia. There were large Jewish settlements, but of course the most significant one was Salonika, which was, for all practical purposes, a Jewish city on Saturday. So I see where this question is coming from, and we hadn't really discussed what I was working on more lately. But I wanted to briefly mention Julia Phillips-Cohen's work on this, because it actually touches upon some of these questions that we have, discussed. And it has to do, she doesn't want to look at Salonika, but it's about, Sephardi notions of citizenship, and how the Sephardi community in the Ottoman Empire was, became part of this project of Ottoman citizenship, building this notion of being Ottoman citizens and putting that in front of, religious or ethnic or sectarian identities. But what I'm looking at now it has to do more with again, it's related. It has to do about questions of, again, belonging, but nationality, the way it was defined in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and also mobility. People, this is when people are moving on a mass scale, it becomes possible to move, and there are also both incentives and also, push factors causing people to move. So it's about immigration into the Ottoman Empire, but not just the Muslims immigration, because that's normally what we think of, because there's a huge wave of immigration into the Ottoman Empire as it's receding, especially, losing territory to Russia or, Russian supported states, or, losing territory to the Habsburgs. And as this contraction is happening, of course, you have the movement of large numbers of Muslims moving into the Ottoman Empire. And it requires, starting after the 1860s, the establishment of special commission to deal with migrants, refugees or migrants. And this is a very, this is a story that we know more or less, but it's being told as a very, story of Muslims, moving. But when you look at it, some others were also aware of what was going on, and there were, in fact, Jews in much smaller numbers, obviously, who knew that the Ottoman Empire had been in the process of setting up certain mechanisms to help migrants, and they were applying, to the consulates, and also, just showing up to take advantage of these. These were things like, being exempt from taxation for a while, being, given land to cultivate, being exempt from military service for a while. So it's really interesting when you look at these. I've been reading documents about this, petitions sent. It's very interesting to see that these people who, you would not imagine would have how would they know what's happening in Istanbul? They do know clearly, and they're writing these petitions saying things like, well, we want to be treated like these groups of refugees who went in and they were, given this and that. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm reading those documents. I'm trying to figure out, first of all, how this knowledge was common knowledge. And then second, it also, what I find also tells me something about the conception of nationality in I would say, the Ottoman bureaucratic notion of nationality and citizenship, the way, they choose to deal with these, would-be migrants. And again, broader questions about human mobility and the borderlands of these empires, the overlapping parts of these lands, they are extremely complicated. And I think we tend to ignore the fact that as sovereignty, the source of sovereignty was changing, shifting, people did know about the legal changes that came with it, and they were able to look for ways to make it serve their purposes and better their living conditions. So this is a very, I'm in the early stages yet. I started in 2019, and you can imagine what happened. So there was a big break, and I took a long pause, and now I'm back to reading my documents, and hopefully I'll come up with something on paper by the end of this year.
Well, we wish you best of luck. Georgi, can you just show Goshe this Arkir Stumbov's comment, which I want to recognize. Arkir Stumbov is a friend of our podcast. He's grew up in Istanbul. Is one of those very small community of Bulgarians in Istanbul, families living in or Constantine, but his family originates from the town of Blatce, which is near Kostur, Kastoria region. It's in that Kastoria. Blatce, Bulgarian Blatce is called. It means like a marsh. Blatce is a marsh. But one of the villages there. And so he wrote this comment, which I think it was very interesting, going back to this idea of Macedonianness and what a meaning of ethnic Macedonian. He just suggested that maybe to decide to be an ethnic Macedonian is a kind of reflection born by the decades to stay out of the conflicts between the master nations in the region and somehow to find the peaceful life. So I thought that was a very interesting and a valuable comment, and I wanted to give you a chance to wrap up the talk today with that thought, your reflection upon it, and your final thoughts about the topic or the topics that we covered today on the podcast.
I don't know. Decide to be an ethnic Macedonian. Does this refer to the early 20th century?
I think that's what he was talking about. Yes.
Okay.
Or more at a later, whatever, in the process of building the identity. It's not a process that starts with a specific date, but you can talk also, if you wanted to respond to this comment a little bit, what was the ethnic Macedonian identity, if any, in the early or mid 20th century, and how did it get in your thoughts, because I just wanted you to respond, to recognize his comment. I thought it was a nice comment, and I wanted you to comment generally. I'd leave the comment up to you.
Well, I mean, I don't know if people would call themselves ethnic anything, but at the same time, yes, if you find yourself caught between, warring factions and people coming and demanding your loyalty, and then state agents and they come and demand other things, of course, people would, I suppose, choose to call themselves, but betters their chances of survival. But I don't think anybody in Macedonia, Ottoman Macedonia, which actually doesn't exist, as you know, the Ottomans did not refer to the region as Macedonia at all, and there are historical reasons for that.
Yes.
But I don't think anybody refer to themselves as ethnic anything. I mean, first of all, there was no such thing as like, they talked about ethnography, but what we call ethnicity today, they and that's, I'm referring to the more educated classes here, they talked about race. So it has nothing to do with our understanding of what race and ethnicity means today, but that was a shorthand for it. So but I'm sure there were lots of people who just, wanted to live in peace, and, they didn't want to kill their neighbors, even if they went to a different church, or they didn't even go to church. And yeah, I think maybe this is a good note to, positive message to end on, that people, when given the I suppose the right tools, and also if you do not push them against the wall, will usually not favor going and killing their neighbors in the name of one identity or the other.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually, if you read toward the end of the book, you have like this nice stories from Ceres, from Siar, and also from other villages, that they are actually sharing schools, the patriarchy, and they exercise, they're sharing churches, and it's very interesting to see that sometimes the patriarchy, when it was closed, they went to the exarchate, and then they just, they were Bulgarians anyway, so what didn't really matter what they went. And this was in the Ottoman archives. So again, I warmly recommend folks to read that. It's going to go for them a very different perspective through the Ottoman archives of what was going on. And I've always been keen on finding non-Bulgarian or non-Macedonian or even non-Greek perspectives, because a third-party perspective will probably give you a more accurate picture. So, Georgi, you want to say a few words to wrap up the show for the day to today?
Actually, no, because really out of time. I'm just very thankful to Professor Yosmaoğlu for her kindness and agreeing to be part of this podcast. So. I would really respect.
Thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
We are honored, really.
Thank you. It was our pleasure. We really appreciate your time and your thoughts sharing with our viewers. Thank you, Professor Yosmaoğlu.
Thank you.
And wish you best of luck with your research, teaching, and let's
I'll
look forward.
come touch base with you again. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, оставаме сами, за да можем без професор Йосмаоğlu да я притесняваме.
Да.
Просто 2-3 минутки за приключване на епизода лайв, просто за да наистина да ни отнемаме от времето. Иване, и към нашите гледачи, всъщност да напомним, че книгата има една много знаменателна фотография като корица.
Аха.
И това е фотография на владиката Германус Каравангелис, косторският владика Германус Каравангелис, който е всъщност един от носителите на гръцкия национален проект в Егейска Македония и въобще в Македония, сниман с турски офицери, османски офицери. Интересна е фотографията и това всъщност беше едно от нещата, които си мислехме ние и по-рано. Нямаше време просто, тъй като
забравихме.
Наложи се и да изтеглим този епизод със седмица напред, да не се чудят гледачите, затова нямаше никакво време да задаваме въпроси, просто професор Йосмаоğlu наистина е заед, има си нейни неща. Важното е, че изобщо успяхме. Това е контакт, който Иван поддържа в продължение на месеци, за да успеем да уредим този епизод. И това беше важното. А книгата, между другото, е много интересна за четене. Наистина много интересна. Така че това, което си мислехме с Иван е, че можем да напомним за Лазар Поп-Трайков. Защото той е липсващия герой на корицата. На тази корица всъщност липсва един много важен герой. Имаме един национален проект, османския, имаме го другия, гръцкия. Какво ни липсва тук? Липсва ни.
Но и понеже книгата е за насилието и ето тя има няколко снимки от точно такива отрязани глави. Това са гръцки войводи. Пак казвам, тя повечето изследвания е в гръцка такова. Но няма отрязаната глава на Лазо Попа-Трайков. И като последен епизод за Илинден, мисля, че да пуснем песента за Лазо Попа-Трайков. Ако само ти можеш ли да я пуснеш през YouTube и да... ето я.
Аз искам първо и да покажа това, защото това е... Сега между другото открихме нова екстра на платената версия на StreamYard, дето се вика "Народните пари са отишли за добро нещо", защото можем да показваме по този начин. Това е всъщност фотография на отрязаната глава на Лазар Поп-Трайков, известен български учител и войвода, деец на вътрешната Македонно-Одринска революционна организация. Особеното е това, което Иван откри, той ми прати тази фотография. Иван е онзи надпис там отстрани. Може би те трябва всъщност да го...
Да, София, 18, това е април 1909 година, подписа на Васил Чакаларов. Христос възкресе. Мисля, че с Р. Христос възкресе. Нещо си Кляшева, ама не мога да го разчита от другата страна.
Има пан Докляшев.
Докляшев, ама нещо си не на майката на Кляшева ли е? Нещо такова има написано, но не мога от лявата страна да го разчита, но е с подписано от Васил Чакаларов и го изпращат. Мисля, че това е картичка, която с точно отрязаната глава на Лазо Поп-Трайков, за която в песента се пее, че гръчки от как беше, гръчки от Тиран беше, гръчки от Деспот е платил 50 лири, нали, на косторски диалект, 50 лири. И всъщност, понеже ние показвахме през цялото време книгата, заедно с Германус Каравангелис, човекът, който е платил allegedly, предполагаемо 50 лири за главата на Лазо Поп-Трайков. За това исках аз да кажем, настоявах и хубаво беше да пуснем и песента за Лазо Поп-Трайков, като също с това да приключиме и празнуването на 120 години от Илинден, нали, в октомври месец.
Футини казва, че в 25 октомври в Гърция е националният ден за почитане, в памет на македонската борба. Това гръцкото иридентистко движение, част от което са ендартите, против българите и против турците. Футини, вие ще го чествате, ние няма да го честваме.
Ние ще си го спестиме това.
Ние няма.
И там се слави Коте от Руля, който сега е Кота с селото, нали? Но Коте от Руля значи предавник, предател, нали, за нас, нали? Човека, който всъщност взел 50 лири на Германос Каравангелис, за да му отреже главата, т.е. да го рани, да му отреже главата и да му я занесе. Това пък британски журналист, мисля, че беше го разказал, новинар го беше разказал, като дори той е държал главата Каравангелис в неговия офис, но после Каравангелис се отричал. Тоест единственото сведоцтво, единствените свидетелски показания са на този британски журналист, че той наистина е държал някъде отрязаната глава. Това показва също така колко жестоко е било и насилието и всъщност как дори тези национални идеи са възникнали в следствие на насилието и в следствие на това, че хората са трябвало да изберат едната, другата или третата страна. Сега, истината и професорката го написала в книгата, въпреки че много не навлезна в разговора, че в крайна сметка другата, четвъртата национална идея, за която Чепреганов твърди, просто не съществува, не отговаря на историческия разказ. И тогава тя попита, аз не знам какво точно учат децата в Македония. Аз трябваше да влезна и да обясня. Те учат, че всъщност македонската национална идея по думите на Чепреганов започнала горе-долу тогава, когато и българската. Нали? С това обаче други хора, като Петър Тодоров, който се надявам да ни гледа, дори включително и Светозаревич, Бранислав Светозаревич, почват вече да разбират, че това не държи вода, нали? И започват да отстъпват назад и твърдат, не е точно тогава, малко по-късно. Нали? Сега въпросът е кога точно, нали? Но всъщност индиректно в нейната труд тя казва, да, това нещо съвременната започва след Втората световна война, нали? Но разбира се, това не означава, че по никакъв начин, че е било изкуствено, вещачко или творение на коминтерната или не знам си какво, нали? Всички други тези, които българската историография пък споделя. Гоше, готов ли сте? Пуснеш Лазо?
Ние няма да правим този тип заключения. Достатъчно е просто да напомним това, което което пише професор Йосмаоğlu, и то е, че този тип твърдения въобще нямат джайб с историческия запис.
Не отговарят, нямат връзка.
Нямат съвместимост. Тоест, това, което е записано, е различно. Иван посочи точно този много интересен подход. Официалната историография като научни институции публикува документите едно към едно. Националният разказ в учебниците, в медиите, през всичките аналитичари и така нататък, обаче е различен. Но имаме работа за вършене. Този епизод е част от тази работа за вършене. Да кажа на Мира от Пловдив, ние нямаме такъв ден, но си мисля, че един от нашите приятели, сега не съм сигурен, Парван Симеонов във Фейсбук беше написал, ние нямаме ден на бежанците, а ние сме земя на бежанци. И може би трябва да се замислим да си намерим един ден на бежанците. И това го казвам сега и в контекста, че наскоро тракийците почитахме едни събития, които са се случили край река Арда 1913 година. Може да видите в страницата на Коридор 8 във Фейсбук, публикувах една моя статия. Тя е посветена на историческата травма. Това е теренно изследване, работа с фокус група и дълбочинни интервюта с хора от селото на татко ми, които 106 години по-късно, след 1913, това съм го правил 19 година, 106 години по-късно разказват за това, което се е случило. По-интересното е как го преживяваме днес. Така че ние имаме тази наша травмата на бежанците, които са прокудени, които са изкоренени от родната си земя. И може би трябва да имаме ден на бежанците. Това си мислех.
И Гоше, да, извинявай, довърши. Последното, което смисъл също беше ценно в разговора, което нали, ние също и българите и македонците се търсим думата българи и македонци в цялата история, но тя каза, вижте, преди са българи и македонци, те са наистина живели заедно. И в този смисъл Османска Македония, въпреки че термина Македония не съществува. Това са солунски, битулски, косовски с център Скопие и одрински вилаети. Одринския не е в Османска Македония. Окей. Там границата всъщност между одрински и солунския вилает е границата и на географска област Македония. Но тия 4 вилаета всъщност по този начин конструирани, нали, формирали Османска Македония. Всъщност тези хора, макар да имали различни езици, са говорили, принадлежали към различни, както тя самата каза, раси. Нали? В този момент това е терминът, който се използва за идентификация. Нали? Те са имали много повече неща, общи неща и от храната, и от облеклото, и от начинът, на който действали. И много пъти наистина не са и мислили преди всичко дали са българи, гърци, македонци, т.е. всички са били македонци, доколкото принадлежали на този проект, но това по-късно и се развива като контекст. Нали? Но преди всичко са и споделяли страшно много неща. От Айвара до лютеницата, до алмите, до всички тия храни, нали, които са. И в този смисъл...
Някои танци, па и някои носи народни дори понякога...
Се заимстват. Апостол Войвода, той каква разлика има между него и примерно албанските националисти, като начин по който се обличат? Нищожна, минимална. И затова някой ти каже, не, ние нямаме заедничка история. И как нямаме заедничка история? Ако това не е заедничка история, факта, че те са живели заедно и не винаги са се избивали заедно и са споделяли от храната до начина на мислене и така нататък. Нали? Ако това не е, кое е? Кое е? Нали? Задавам аз въпроса. Нали? Така че, да, заедничката история или обща история е широко понятие и ние може би разбираме малко по-тясно и конкретно случая с Македония, но тя съществува и наистина трябва да мислим много пъти в тия категории, а не да се опитваме да изграждаме вещачки, изкуствени граници, там където такива граници не е имало, особено в този период. Не говоря физически граници като териториални, а и граници на мислене, на идентичност, на комуникация, на така нататък.
Отлично, отлично. Да опитаме сега да видим дали ще стане отново през YouTube с поделяне. Ако ли не стане, ще я пуснеш ти от твоя телефон. Но първо да видим от тук. И ти ще ми кажеш всъщност дали се получава или не. Само секунда. Така. То като екран се споделя. Сега да видим музиката дали ще тръгне. Ако тръгне, ми дай вдигнат палец.
Koliko sramno, sramno esti zagrebski despot. Ščoko klave zvero, ko prekaza koli lazo. Ščoko klave zvero, ko prekaza koli lazo. Da kažem Bog da prosti Lazo, papa Trajko. Aj da kažem Bog da prosti Lazo, papa Trajko. Prvi joj najgolenjo kostumski načalnik. Prvi joj najgolenjo kostumski načalnik.
Песента за Марко Лерински ще оставяме за друг път. Тя видяхте на плейлиста и скочи. Много наши гробово имаме, което вече не съществуват, за жалост. И на Лазар Поп-Трайков няма гроб. И на Марко Лерински гроба в Пътеле е унищожен.
Гоше, покажи двата коментара на Фотини Толуди и за 0 в 9:35 и 36. Да.
Да, това е исторически запис в Гърция.
Така, и това се поддържа и от книгата на професор Йосмаоглу.
Да. Има македонци като регионални по това време. Няма етнически. Да. И така. Аз за това много харесвам книгата Алексис Зорбас. И защото тя е един особен вик към човещина, към човечност. Късният Зорбас, разбира се. Този дете е остарял и помадрял Зорбас, но той казва това. Едно време ми беше важно дали си българин, дали си турчин, дали си грък. Ама сега вече ми е важно дали си добър човек.
Да.
И това го казва човек, който е участвал точно в тази македонска борба. Зорбас, като фиктивен образ, но все пак той е един македономах.
Да.
Аргир ни пише, тази песен ние да сме благодарни на ансамбъл Гоце Делчев от София. Това е техен запис, прекрасен, много хубаво изпълнение. Поне за мен е най-доброто, което се намира в YouTube. Ансамбъл Гоце Делчев тази година участваха на възпоменанието от смъртта на Гоце Делчев, което организира маестро Христо Христов в Националния дворец на децата в София. Мисля, че беше 2 май. И също този ансамбъл се яви и пя прекрасни македонски песни. Сега ето с тяхна песен. Това за мен е наистина най-добрата версия на тая песен за Лазар Поп-Трайков. И така, може би да е време да си кажем довиждане.
Да живее България.
Ма да си пуснем пак нашата любима музика, защото и да си спомням кой беше епизода, да пуснем нашият химн. Сега е момента.
Да живее България, да живее Македония.
Слава на Украина!